Please stand by, starting soon. Whatever, I'm just going to go. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. All right. Okay. You guys ready? Wow, that's loud. Y'all ready? Okay. Welcome to our very small group. I've been trying to get live streaming set up this entire time, and it's not working, so you guys are the special ones. So, a few quick announcements. Thank you very much for Brandon for setting up the Crafting Code Tour, and Larry for flying in from Chicago. Sweet, got it right. And Brandon flew all the way in from Maryland, correct? Yes. By the way of Florida and Texas and everywhere else, and tonight he will be flying. Tomorrow morning you're flying. Tomorrow morning he will be flying to Milwaukee, and then... You saw the sky. You think I'm going to wander around that? Yeah, it's kind of nuts outside today. It'd be the last talk I get. So, welcome to you two. A quick few announcements. Midwest PHP dates are going to be announced soon. I hope to have that announced by the end of this month. And I had... next month is not going to be the first Thursday of the month again. We're actually going to have it on August 20th. We're having another speaker come in all the way from Chicago. He's going to be doing a mental health talk. One thing to note, though, is I need you to sign up on Eventbrite because I only have 200 tickets because that's all Nerdy can hold. Right now we're at 48 tickets, so please make sure to sign up there if you'd like to come. I'll make sure that date is posted. And I think that's all I had for announcements. Brandon has been nice enough to bring us some gift cards to give away to everybody, so I will get those handed out while they get started. And there's also some t-shirts, some stickers, and other stickers. Oh, and you have buttons on the table by the pizza, so please help yourself. So, Brandon, here you go.
Well, thank you all for coming out this evening. As Jonathan said, this is the 12th stop of the Crafting Code Tour. About 6 months or so ago, there was a discussion on the user group list for admins of user groups, saying roughly along the lines of, it's really, really hard to get people to come in from the outside, it's expensive, logistics are difficult, user groups don't often have a lot of money, how can we solve this problem? And I said to myself, well, I take this as a challenge, but I'm not just going to go to one user group, I'm going to go to as many as will have me. That turns out it's 19, and I realized I had bitten off a little more than I could chew. So, as a result of this, I decided that I was going to do a couple of things. The first one was I invited some people to come along with me. The tour started with Cal Evans and then Paul Jones, and now Larry Garfield is here with me, and he's going to be your main speaker for the evening, which is good because I'll have a voice by the time I'm done with the tour. The other thing is that because doing this, especially when you add someone else or other people, it becomes much more expensive. And so I asked a few other companies in the community to sponsor the tour to help pay for some of these things. And the one company that's really done more than any other to make this possible is one that's called Code Climate. They've been working on something for PHP, and I told them that I would share it with you and give you the gift cards and stickers. So I'm going to do that now, and a 5-minute little spiel about it, and then I'll turn it over to Larry. Okay, so this is working, good. So all of us have complexity in our applications. Our applications get complexity from a variety of different places. Our domains have complexity in them. When we trade simplicity for features, we get complexity. We have issues with deadlines. We have issues with the fact that our team is changing. No team is stable. People come, people go. Sometimes our business models change. We decide we're going to do one thing, and then we pivot to something else. And, of course, we have people at different skill levels in our teams. So what can we do about this? In a perfect world, we'd collect some information and then we would act on the information. And so how do we do this? What's the process that we go through? And there are a couple of things that we could do to make this easier. The first one we could try is code reviews. Anybody in here do code reviews on a regular basis? That is more hands by percentage than I've seen in other talks, so I like that. I'm a big fan of code reviews. At Mozilla, when I worked there, we did code reviews for everything. One line change, got a code review. Now, sometimes we broke that rule, but not very often. And the idea was that every piece of code should be reviewed by someone else. But code reviews have some advantages. Namely, when you sit down with another developer and you talk, you guys learn from each other. The developer learns from you, you learn from him, you learn new ways of doing things, so learning happens. And you catch things before they go into production. That's the real key of the code review, is we want to catch stuff before it goes into production. But when it comes to code reviews, there are some drawbacks as well. They're really subjective. When I was at Mozilla, there was this one guy, it would take 4 rounds of code review to get anything into the system because he would decide he wanted to do lists differently today. And so he would decide to go in and mark up a bunch of stuff that he had said was fine yesterday. That sucks, and I avoided him like the plague. In addition, code reviews tend to silo the information. If I talk to Larry and Larry talks to me, that's great. I learn and he learns, but you on our team don't learn because he and I had the conversation. So unless that conversation is public, and rarely it is, the information tends to get siloed. In addition, because we all have deadlines, they tend to be inconsistently applied. So I've heard, damn the code reviews, full speed ahead, let's just get this thing out the door. And because we're all developers doing the code reviews, sometimes it takes a very long time for us to get to them. So when it comes to the qualitative data of our code, it's really hard to know if we're getting any better. So sometimes we turn to the qualitative side. We say the quantitative, the numbers side, and we say, let's use some software metrics tools. And there's some advantages to this. They're more objective. We eliminate the guy who takes 4 rounds of code review because now we have numbers, and numbers don't lie, right? Yeah, they do, but that's another talk. We can do something with this information that's actionable. We can do something with it. Okay, that's good. We can make use of this. On the other hand, they tend to be fairly noisy. I remember turning on PHP Code Sniffer once for coding standards, getting 400 lines of you should fix these double spaces, and turning it off because that wasn't interesting to me. That wasn't what I was looking for. In addition, it can be difficult to set these up and maintain them, especially the older ones that are still in pair or not part of Composer. And then as a result, these often don't get checked. Okay, so when it comes to quantitative data, it's really hard to know if we're getting any better. So the Code Climate guys, when they sat down, they said, this sucks, and then we want to do something about it. And they started in Ruby, and they came up with a couple of things. The first thing they did is they gave all their code a GPA, 4-point scale, where does our code fall? The other thing they said is we want to look at the change over time. So they came up with a timeline that shows, okay, this file got better, this file got worse, and that shows us change over time. And the idea here is that we want this to be trackable. We want to have objective, clear measurement. We want to know if we improved over time in a particular given period of time. We want to know if our test coverage has gotten any better. And we want to know if this branch improved or decreased the quality of our code. In addition, they came up with some graphs. Now, this is PHP MyAdmin, which I don't think has changed in 4 years. But if it had, you'd see this graph change, hopefully up and to the right. I'm sorry? Well, apparently not recently. At least not when this graph was created. But anyway, you'd see this graph hopefully going up and to the right. And the idea here is that we want this to be visible too. We want to understand what's going on. We want to have responsibility for what's going on. We want to set some goals based on what's going on. And then we want to be able to show a non-technical person, when they walk up and they say, why is this taking so long? You can actually say, look at all these grades that are really, really bad. When I tell you the code sucks, here's proof. We need to fix this in order to make our jobs easier. And they can understand that. They can see the improvement over time, and they can see and directly correlate improvements in the code with improvements in efficiency. If you have it set up right, Code Climate will bug you when things happen. In this case, this code went from an A to an F, and it says in the chat room right away, we have a problem here. And this is really great because remember I said most tools you don't check. Well, this one will bother you. It won't wait for you to come to it. It'll come to you. And the idea was to make this actionable so you could see recently introduced problems before they get into production and do it as part of your code reviews. If you use this as part of your code reviews, Code Climate is really fast. Developers are really slow because they have other things to do. So you commit your code and you realize when you look at this, hey, my quality went down. You can fix that before you even bother a developer, before you even sit down with a developer to look at your code. You can save that developer that time. It'll also let you compare between branches. So this is WordPress 3.5 compared against master. And we can see that it got worse in quality by a half a GPA point. I don't know how they made WordPress core worse, but they did. And here's the proof. And it will show you the files as they've changed. This went from an F to an F, which means that the F got worse, okay? The quality degraded even more. But you can know, did the quality get better or worse? Hopefully your quality will get better, but of course we all are worried about our quality getting worse. And this shows you can actually compare and you can know which files are going to degrade if I merge this into master. It will also show you in big, bold boxes where you have a problem. Complexity is red, duplication is orange, and over here on the left you can see this red here. That's test coverage. If you hook this up to Jenkins and tell it, give me my test coverage reports, it will tell you where your test coverage is happening and where you don't have any test coverage. Code Climate started in Ruby. They expanded into JavaScript, and now they're expanding into PHP. And I'm really excited about this. I've used this tool. I think it's really great. I don't work for them. I work for myself, so when I say it's a good tool for developers, it's not because they're paying me to do it. And it's free for open source, which I think is really great. So if you have an open source project, I want to see Drupal in this. Throw it up there, take a look at it. For your company, you have a gift card for 2 months free to Code Climate for corporate accounts. It works with any Git repo. It does not have to be on GitHub. As long as you can use keys to access it, you can put this on Code Climate. I think it's fantastic. Any questions I can answer before I turn this over to Larry? I'm sorry? I don't believe it integrates with IDEs. It does integrate with like chat, Twitter, things like that to tell you when something has gone wrong. And you can, it has obviously branch comparison, but they are, I believe, in open source, their integration components so that you can write integrations for it. But it doesn't integrate with anything on the desktop because it's obviously web hosted. That's a good question. With what? Yes. Yeah, I think that was a hip chat. But I'm not 100% sure, but I remember them mentioning hip chat, so I'm like 99% sure it integrates with that. So, yeah.
So does it just work with Git if you have to push to it, or like let's say you're currently using an SVN, like is there ways that you can like export Git and then import it as like steps?
So SVN is a little tricky. I don't believe it supports SVN. And you're testing the limits of my knowledge. But I believe you can use get SVN to create a Git repo and just have it pull every time SVN is updated. I think that's possible. And it's very fast at doing this analysis. I think you can, if you can designate it, I think if you can designate it as part of the URL, it'll only get the part you ask for. So I'm not being a Git expert, I don't know if you can specify in the URL what you want. If you can, I think you're in good shape. If you can't, then you may find yourself with a little bit more challenge. That being said, of course, Git is really fast at transmitting large files. This is really fast at analyzing the files because it spreads it across. It doesn't take the whole thing and analyze them one at a time. It spreads it across and it analyzes them all at the same time, throws it all in a database, and then analyzes the results. So even if you have 1,000 files, it's not going to take 3 days for it to analyze them because it's going to do it all. It's going to spin up the instances to do it simultaneously. So. I have. They asked me, since I was doing the tour, they said, would you look at this and tell us where they really want the feedback, and they said, tell us where we screwed up. And I spent a couple hours with them talking about things that I think they need to improve. And they're interested in your feedback as well. As a community, they want to know where does this suck, where is this great, what can we do to make this better, what can we do to make this a tool that you are excited to use. Like you commit code and the first thing you do is you go check it to see whether or not your code quality improved. How do we do that? How do we make that happen? So that's, they are interested definitely in the feedback of the community.
Is there a lot of support for like, say, changing your code standards?
There's no code standard enforcement in Code Climate. I don't know that they're ever going to add that. Complexity and duplication at the moment are the two. I know they want to add like code smells like die statements or globals and things like that. But it'll show you your complexity exceeds the threshold, or you have code duplication, and it'll even match if you change the symbols. So this variable to another variable, it'll still match that, because it does both fuzzy matching and explicit matching. It'll catch both of those.
So it has a bug tracker in it built in as well?
It doesn't have a bug tracker built in. It integrates with several bug trackers, and you can open an issue right from the application. Okay. So if you see something and you go, well, this is no good, you can click a button. So if you have more questions, that's great. I'd love to chat more about it after. I'm going to turn it over to Larry so that, So ladies and gentlemen, this is Larry Garfield. He works for Palantir. He's also a Drupal core contributor, or maybe the Drupal only core contributor. I don't know. Maybe this is why Drupal 8 is taking so long. He has come all the way from Chicago to speak to us this evening. So Larry, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll put your slides up and let you introduce yourself.
All right. So I'm just going to talk a bit here while we mess with technology. So first question, who here writes PHP? Who here has been writing PHP 2 years or less? 5 years or less? 10 years or less? Okay. Who's been writing who remembers writing in PHP 3? I feel your pain. 4.9, all right. That's late. All right. So what I want to talk about here are some changes that have been happening in the PHP world in the past several years that are kind of critically important. Hang on. There we go. So my name is Larry Garfield. You may know me online as Krell. If you want to make fun of me on Twitter while I'm talking, that's where you do it. I'm a senior architect with Palantir.net. We're a web development firm based in Chicago, doing mostly institutional nonprofits, universities, museums, hospitals, and so forth. That's kind of our standby business market. We work mostly with Drupal, also some Symfony and Silex. We're just getting into that. For Drupal 8, I am the Web Services Initiative Lead, which means you can blame me for about a third of all the changes in Drupal 8, the good third. And that's not true. There's 3/4 of it is good, but you can only blame me for a third of it. I'm advisor to the Drupal Association, Drupal representative to the Framework Interoperability Group, and lovable pedant. My colleagues at Palantir will tell you that the second half of that is absolutely true. They may disagree with the first half. So I want to start off by talking about pollution, but not this kind. Not the kind of pollution that clogs your lungs and makes it hard to see, but this kind, the kind that clogs up our computers. Quite simply, we have too much code. I know as developers our job is to produce code, but we have too much code in the world. There is simply too much code out there, and this is a problem. Does anyone know who this is? Fred Brooks, excellent, you get a cookie. Fred Brooks, project lead for IBM System 360, one of the first large-scale operating systems, who then went on to do a book called The Mythical Man Month, which everyone working in software should read twice. And one of the things he talked about in the book and in an essay called No Silver Bullet that he published as a follow-up is that incidental complexity in software is mostly solved. That is, things that make programming hard that aren't inherent in it being a program, we've solved most of those. We no longer have to write our programs in punch cards, take them to a computer, run them, get a parse error, take them back to our desk, figure out what's going on, try again. We now have a computer that sits on our desk. We have real-time debuggers. We have memory management. We have all of these tools that make our lives easier so that the things that are hard in development today are things that are hard because the problem space is hard. Programming is hard, and this is the essential complexity that we can't get rid of. And we are past the era where we're going to see tenfold improvements in programmer efficiency. No new programming language or new programming technique or IDE is going to give you a tenfold improvement in your productivity. And it sounds like, oh great, we're doomed. But there is one silver lining that he pointed out, that is the most radical possible solution for constructing software is to not construct it at all. Don't build things you don't have to. And he referred to this as commercial off-the-shelf software, which is basically, buy it. Don't write your own print driver, buy it. Don't write your own spreadsheet. There are 3 companies, in this in the 80s, selling them for you. Don't write your own mail server. There are several available. Just buy one of those. And don't write it yourself. And that saves time. That makes you a lot more productive. In a follow-up, even a decade later, he said the same thing. The best way to attack the essence of building software is not to build it at all, because it has already been built. Makes sense? Now, he didn't use the phrase, but what he's describing is open source. Don't rewrite something when it already exists. Share it instead, and everyone is more productive. That's the idea behind open source, and that's exactly what Brooks is talking about. The way to be more productive is to write less code. And the way to write less code is to reuse more code. The more code you can reuse, the more productive you are. But there's one caveat here. This is a quote from an engineer at Jet Propulsion Labs that Brooks quoted. If a software engineer perceives it to be more expensive to reuse an existing component, he won't. He'll just write a new one. Note, perceives. It doesn't matter what the actual cost would be. It doesn't matter how hard it would actually be to write something. If a developer thinks it will be harder to reuse something than to just write it himself, he'll write a new one. Right? You all agree on that one? Yeah. Bottom line, sharing has to be easy or it won't happen. Sharing has to be easy or it won't happen. And sharing is how open source works. That is how the entire open source ethos and community and development model works. And if you suck at sharing, that's how open source projects die. So who remembers these days? Back when Pear was just coming out, circa 2000 or so, PHP extension and application repository, this was really the only way to share code in the PHP world, circa 2000. Founded on this great new thing called PHP 4, this game-changing new version of the language. Oh God. Only one problem. To actually use it, you need it to be root. Raise your hand if you have root on a shared host. I didn't think so. I never did. There are ways to get around that, but all of them sucked. It assumed that you had root on any server and that you ran one application on a server. I mean, really, who in 2000 did that? These days you just use containers, but these days, back then you didn't. And getting a new package into the system was really complicated. There was forms you had to fill out, and I mean paper forms, and there was a vetting process, and very few people were crazy enough to try and use it. And it was very easy to get things wrong, because just getting code included properly in PHP 4 was hard. And that, you'd think, including code, this should be easy. No, it was actually kind of hard. And so, circa 2000, early PHP, we can't have nice things. Where do I find code to reuse? Well, it's either in Pear or you copy and paste it off someone's blog, because blogs are the new hotness as well. How do I get the code? I've located it, and how do I get it into my system? Well, you copy and paste, or you have root. And that's pretty much it. And copying and pasting someone else's code into your repository sucks, and having root, you don't, so you can't do anything. All right, now how do I load that code? I've got the code in my repository. How do I actually load the code in so I can use it? Well, you have lots of include statements lying around, and you hope you get them in the right order. And what if I'm pulling in code from lots of different people? And by lots, I mean 2. Well, lots and lots of manual include statements. And so you just load everything at the beginning of your program and hope. What do you do if you have a name clash? Because 2 different projects use the same name for a function. Well, if you're well-behaved, you have insanely long function names that describe everything about every package and every system you're using, and that means your code is full of insanely long function and class names. That's if you're using classes. how can I work together? I mean, if I want to collaborate with someone on some third-party piece of code, I want to help out, I want to contribute back, I want to be a good open source citizen, well, maybe it's on SourceForge, if you're lucky. I don't know if SourceForge is considered lucky, though. Yeah, it was hard. And what about swapping out pieces of code? Can I take a part of my system and take it out and replace it with something else? Yeah, good luck with that. Pretty much everything is going to be hard-coded. Just get used to it. This sucked. Who remembers these days? This sucked, didn't it? PHP sucked at sharing, which meant we developed a culture in PHP that said, this is my island. There are many like it, but this one is mine. And I am not going to get off this island. I'm going to just write my own code and ignore everyone else. The syntax of PHP itself is the only thing we have in common. And, okay, stuff got done, but really, this is a problem. Maybe you worked on a big project like Drupal. Drupal has some 25,000 add-on modules for it. That's wonderful, it's great, all this sharing and all this collaboration, and 98% of the world doesn't care. If you have code, Drupal runs 2% of the web. That's awesome. And if you have code that works with Drupal, 98% of the web doesn't care. It is totally useless to them. They cannot share it or collaborate. Or maybe you use Joomla, and they've got, what is it, somewhere around 6,800, maybe it's up to 7,000 extensions by now. Great, wonderful, people can reuse this on other Joomla projects, and 97% of the world couldn't care less, because it is totally useless to them, because this is Joomla code, not PHP code. All right, maybe you work with the really big boys, WordPress, and okay, 25,000 plugins there, good, wonderful, and less than 20% of the web cares. We all make fun of WordPress, but they have nearly 20% of the web running WordPress. And even then, a WordPress plugin, 18% of the world can use it, that's it. And if you're pretty much anybody else, and you're writing extensions for any other platform, you don't count. Sorry to pretty much everyone who's not WordPress, Drupal, or Joomla, you don't even register statistically. You're statistical noise. And so any extensions, any add-ons, any code sharing that happens for those platforms is statistical noise. But pretty much this is the best we could do in PHP at this point. That's all we could do. The idea of not invented here, NIH, became the cultural norm. Of course you're only going to use your own stuff. You're not going to share, because you can't. It's too hard to bother reusing someone else's code. Which is a problem, given that PHP, if you could actually write something that is compatible with any PHP system, that's 80% of the web. 80% of the web is PHP. And why are you writing something that only works on 2% of the web? That's silly. The average PHP programmer has written 2.5 frameworks in his career. Own up to it. Who has? Yeah, the same people who have been around for a while. You're not a real PHP developer until you've written your own CMS. Own up to it. A few more hands, yep. Remember, sharing is how open source works, and sucking at sharing is how open source dies. But that was PHP. That was PHP then. And I'm happy to report that this has changed, and the PHP world has finally grown up. PHP is now old enough to vote and serve in the military. So how did we get there? How did this happen? The first step was, well, class autoloading. Seems so simple and mundane. But one of the big changes that came with PHP 5 back in 2004 was class autoloading. Basic idea, if you try to use a class that isn't defined yet, instead of giving you a fatal, PHP will call this magically named function and give you a chance at the last second to load that class into memory. Great, wonderful. And the core team quickly realized that having a single function in the entire program was a terrible idea, so you could register multiple. Cool. And great, problem solved. I can load code. Except for one little problem. Who actually ran PHP 5? Yeah, I hear people laughing. You remember these days too. Developers, this is 3 years after PHP 5 came out. we're still saying, I can't use it. I can't find a web host that's going to support it. The web hosts are saying, no one's using it, so why should I upgrade? Why should I go to all this work? PHP internals are saying, I'd love to drop support for PHP 4, but all the hosts are still running it. We can't leave them out in the cold. And so all the big projects are saying, if we drop support for PHP 5, or for PHP 4, no one will be able to use our platform, and we're all going to lose market share. Really, guys? Really? Yeah. But this wasn't good enough. So in summer of 2007, a group of us got together and said, enough is enough, and launched the Go PHP 5 project. The organizers were actually primarily people from Drupal, of all places, plus Mark Delisle from PHP MyAdmin. And we launched with 6 projects, all saying, as of this date, our releases will all require at least PHP 5.2. Hosts, you're on notice. You have until then, or you're going to lose all of us. We are going to all be first so that none of us lose by being the first one out there. One dirty little secret, though, if you look at these projects, 3 of them were already on PHP 5. They were small projects that no one was using, so they could do that. It was 3 projects that made this happen: Drupal, PHP MyAdmin, and Typo3. 3. So we launched in July with 6 projects, and I think maybe 5 or 6 hosts who had committed to offering PHP 5.2 by default. A month later, we had 100 projects and over 200 hosts signed on saying, this is it, we are done with PHP 4, we are moving forward together. And a week after we launched, the PHP internals list announced that they were EOLing PHP 4 as well. They never actually admitted that there's any causal relationship here, but I've always believed there is one. Nice. All right. Took a while. Took 3 years, but one problem solved. Autoloading. We can now actually load people's code. Great. Wonderful. What's next? GitHub. This has nothing to do with PHP specifically, but GitHub changed the nature of open source development. Whatever you may think of Git or of GitHub or whatever, their contribution to making it easy to collaborate cannot be overstated. Their slogan, build software better together. I love this. This is the essence of open source. You have this simple interface. I'm sure you've all seen this at this point. Beats the pants off of source forward. The combination of Git and GitHub, really. Threw the doors wide open for better collaboration between projects, between people. As of 2013, actually, the 3 most prolific contributors on GitHub were all PHP. It's Matthew O'Finney, project lead for Zend, Fabien Pontoncier, project lead for Symfony, Taylor Otwell, project lead for Laravel. PHP benefited enormously from GitHub. Next problem down. We can collaborate on GitHub. That's where open source happens, except for a few small islands like Drupal, but we won't get into that. Next up, namespaces. More language level support. Namespaces came in with PHP 5.3. Who's used PHP 5.3 so far? Not the entire room? Not quite the entire room? Okay. If you haven't, start now. If you were using PHP 5.2 and earlier, any of the major frameworks, you had code that looked like this. Every single class was prefixed with the name of the project. So the name of the project was littered all over your entire program in obscenely long class names. And if you wanted to use stuff from multiple projects, then you had multiple obscenely long class names with different formats in them, different coding standards in them. Lovely. And oh dear, if you were using pair. With namespaces, it becomes much, much easier. You declare a namespace for a file, then your class, the full name of the class is ZenForm Factory, but you don't have to type that. Then you can just use that class, by its short name, anywhere in that namespace, and import classes from other namespaces, and your code is nice and simple and clean, and you can pull stuff in from other namespaces as well. and all of your code is nice and simple and clean, and all is right with the world. Seems a simple thing, but it means people can actually reuse code and not have name clashes, and not have class names that won't fit on the slide. Class names that are too long for a slide are too long. Another problem down. Great. Now what do we do with them? This brings us to the PHP standards group. Who heard of the PHP standards group? A number of people, all right. You remember this dark period in PHP history. A couple of project leads and other key people happened to run into each other at the PHP Tech Conference in Chicago in May of 2009, right before PHP 5.3 came out. And they got together and said, you know what? We should probably collaborate on how we're going to use this namespace stuff and, do the same thing. Might be nice. What a concept. So they got together and got drunk in a smoke-filled hotel room and came up with a common standard for how to deal with namespaces and autoloading, because it's the kind of thing you want to have a standard. Disclaimer, I was not actually at this conference, so I cannot guarantee there was smoke, but it was a PHP conference, so I'm pretty sure there was drinking. Only a few laughs at that one, all right. So the standard was called PSR 0, PSR standing for PHP Standard Recommendation, at least originally. Now it stands for PSR. And 0 because computer people don't know how to count. And it's a common autoloading standard for everyone to use that was based on namespaces. Very, very simple. It's inspired by what Java was doing, by what Pair was doing. And it's really basic, very rudimentary, but enough. Enough that projects could collaborate. It says, quite simply, you have to have a top-level namespace. You can't pwn that for your actual classes. And then put your classes somewhere under there. And then when that gets auto-loaded, it will map directly to the path name on disk. So you use that class, and then this is effectively the line of code that gets to run. So namespace separators and underscores for backward compatibility get turned into forward slashes, and you include it. So when you include this class, that's what ends up getting run. Nice and simple and basic, and everyone can understand it. And they announced this to the world, and actually some of the people who were at this meeting had admin access on php.net. And so they set up a mailing list called a PHP standards group, php standards at list.php.net, excuse me. And declared themselves the PHP standards group, and this was their spec, and that's the end of it. And this is the worst launch in the history of mankind. Because really, if you take a large group of developers around the world who are used to not collaborating and doing their own thing at all times and not being aware of what any other projects are doing, and come out and say, "Behold, for we are the PHP standards group who have declared how autoloading shall happen for all to obey," you'd be pretty pissed too, wouldn't you? Yeah, it went over like a lead balloon. And very quickly, the group was thrown off of the php.net architecture, moved to Google Groups, started arguing with each other a lot, eventually admitted a few new projects, did pretty much nothing in 2010. I actually went back and checked the archives. There were 3 or 4 email messages the entire year to the list. And finally woke up in 2011 and started arguing again. So yeah, not the greatest start. But hey, at least we know how to load code now, right? It's something. Next, Composer. Who's using Composer already? All right, I can go through this part quickly then. Composer actually began life with Symfony 2. The Symfony framework launched its initial alpha of the 2.0 series at Symfony Live in Paris in February of 2010. And for reasons no one could quite figure out, the PHPB project was already there to announce that they were rebuilding on it. They haven't actually launched that yet, but open source. And they did this weird thing. Symfony 2 was going to use third-party libraries, some of which were written by the same people writing Symfony, sure, but separate standalone systems, like Doctrine, or Monologue, or Ascetic. And they very quickly, therefore, ran into this concept of dependency hell. You all run into this before, right? And so this said, all right, we're going to need a dependency system. Great. They're not the first ones to say that. Other projects have had dependency systems. Drupal has one it built. But they did something different and said, it's dumb to make a Symfony-specific dependency system. Really, how would that help anybody? So, sometime in April of 2011, Nils Ederman of PHPPP, at the prodding and kickstarting from Fabien Pontossier, the Symfony project lead, started putting libzip to PHP. Libzip is the dependency resolution library that is part of OpenSUSE. So all the definitions in Composer for required packages and so forth came from there. Meanwhile, Jordi Borgiano, who was the project lead of Monologue, started working on a front end for Pair that doesn't suck, called Packagist. And I can fully get behind this concept of Pair that doesn't suck, really. And they ran into each other and sat down over a nice Korean restaurant somewhere and got together and turned their work into Composer, a tool for dependency management in PHP, which allows you to declare dependent libraries for your project and will install them in your project for you. What does that mean? It means you no longer have to copy and paste things. It means it takes care of dependency hell for you. It means every project can declare its own dependencies. I can require Monologue, Monologue can require this other thing, and so forth, and the system will just figure it out for me. Because that's a boring, hard task, and computers are good at boring, hard tasks. That's why they're there, to do boring, hard tasks, so I don't have to. You can do post-build tasks, all kind of stuff. Launched in September of 2011 on packages.org. And people started using it immediately. It didn't work, but people were using it anyway, because it was kind of needed. Symfony 2.1 was built entirely from Composer. If you use, who's used Symfony recently? The correct way to install Symfony is to pull the entire thing through Composer, and almost all of it is treated as third-party code. It's a great setup. That is how the entire system is built to be used. As of yesterday, when I checked, there were over 33,000 packages available on Packagist. Most of them are not Symfony packages. They are simply reusable PHP components that anyone can download through an automated system. For those few in the room who are not already using Composer, start now. Here's how. You run one line to install it on your system. It's just a PHP command line app. And then you create a Composer JSON file with name of your package or your program. Tell it what you require. I require Guzzle 3.4 point anything. And I want my code to auto-load using PSR0, and it's going to be in that directory. Boom, that's it. Run install, and it downloads Guzzle and installs, and why is it downloading the Symfony event dispatcher? I didn't specify the Symfony event dispatcher. Did you specify the Symfony event dispatcher? No, nobody did. Guzzle did. Guzzle 3 requires a Symfony event dispatcher, so it takes care of it. Great. You didn't even have to think about that. The code is now there for me to use. Side note, since I made these slides, Guzzle 4 no longer uses the Symfony event dispatcher, but I'm keeping it on the slide because it's a great example. And you're done. And then it's this generating autoload files thing. What is that? It means you include one file in your code, and you never think about include statements again. Noise, yes. And it just kind of magically works. Yeah, there's more to it than that. Go see a talk on Composer. There's plenty more to say about it. Bottom line is, it's awesome. So where do we find code? You find reusable code on Packagist. How do you get it? Composer. Problem solved. And we're almost done. One problem still remains, and that's exchanging code. How do we do that? And that's our last step, common interfaces. I mean, that's really the point of an interface, right? That you can write to an interface and then swap out the code. That's kind of the point. But you need to have a common interface first to be able to do that. And it'd be really great if we had those. And we agree. The Framework Interoperability Group, what used to be called the PHP Standards Group, when it finally woke up and decided to be useful, renamed itself to the Framework Interoperability Group in June of 2012. So it's 2 years ago now. We actually started being a useful organization. And it took another year, but we eventually defined an actual process for how we go about approving specifications. We approved some before that too, but we eventually added a process to it. And started releasing common interfaces like PSR3, which is a common logging interface. Inspired by Monolog, not surprisingly, because the editor for it is Jordi Boggiano of Monolog, but also by Drupal, because Drupal had a logging framework, and so we had requirements that we knew we needed in a large-scale multilingual system. And so we worked, the Drupal representatives, both myself and others who were not voting reps, worked with the people working on PSR3, worked with the framework interoperability group, and built a good common standard. This is kind of PSR3 junior version. And so the important part is this one interface. You implement this interface, which is in this namespace, and you can write a logger. You want to log from your application? Don't write a logger interface. Write to this existing interface. And you no longer have to think about it, because then you can just throw Monolog at it, or throw Drupal's logging system at it, or throw WordPress's, maybe not WordPress, throw Zen's logging system at it, throw Log4PHP at it, and your code doesn't care, because it's writing to this one common universal interface. We have more coming up. PSR6. This is a unified caching interface. This is in final review at this point. I expect it to be approved in the next couple of weeks. Defines cache pools and cache items. It's designed from the ground up to be extensible. We spent a lot of time trying to make sure that we're not implementing a complete end-to-end, all-encompassing cache solution. We're implementing a common baseline. So if you need very simple cache support in your application, or more specifically in your library, just write to this interface and let whoever's using it provide a cache backend that supports that. We do have support for multi-get and multi-set operations. We have support for expiration. We may or may not deal with stampede protection. That's the last thing we have to figure out. Someone just brought that up recently. We probably won't provide a mechanism for stampede protection. Just make sure that you can add one. Disclaimer, I'm the editor on this one, so you can sort of blame me for the fact that it's taken a while. But very simple. If you have, this is actually an example straight out of the documentation for it. You get your cache pool, you get your items out of it. If it's a cache hit, or if it's not a cache hit, great. Set it, and then return. There's more to it than that, with much more capability, but it can be just that simple. You start using this interface, you write this code, and you no longer have to think about caching backends. Great, you want MySQL-based caching, you want Redis-based caching, someone else will write it for you and you can just use it, which is what we're after in the first place. PSR7, this one is also in late review, probably going to be approved fairly soon. This is for HTTP messages as a request response. Think of it as like Symfony's HTTP Foundation library junior version. It does just request response, it doesn't do the full whole 9 yards that Symfony does, but it's enough. It's enough that it can be used for clients and for servers. So you can actually have an object, a request object come out of Guzzle, which is a HTTP client library, and use that request or response object in, say, Symfony, if it implements these libraries, or in Zen, if it implements these interfaces. And you can just swap these back and forth and around. Okay, some systems will extend them, that's fine. But the common baseline is there, and we can build on that together. The editor for this one is, unsurprisingly, Michael Dowling of Guzzle. It's mostly a bunch of getters and setters, but it's a common set of getters and setters, because that's really all you need for a value object. But the fact that it's a common set means we can all use the same one. Very simple, not very aggressive, but the fact that it exists is the important part. So lots of stuff for headers, and then request and response. Again, nothing really exciting, but what's exciting is that it's shared, that it's common, that we can all use the same one. Not just things that look kind of alike, but things that are actually compatible in code. And so finally, after 14 years, we can have nice things. Finally, we can collaborate in the PHP world. Finally, the PHP community can build bridges and be a community rather than a lot of little communities. The way to be more productive is to write less code, which means to reuse more code, which means to share more code. Sharing can now be easy. And I think one of the best examples of this change, and kind of the flagship of this new PHP, is Drupal 8. Let's be honest, Drupal 7 was one of the worst offenders for doing its own thing. Those of you that have used Drupal know what I'm talking about. No more. This is the mission statement we had for the Web Services Initiative for Drupal 8. We need to evolve quickly from a first-class CMS to a first-class REST server that includes a first-class CMS, because that's what you need to be in order to compete these days. And we have to do it fast. That means let's not do it ourselves. And started looking around. All right, is there anything we can use to give us a leg up? And we said, yes! Yes, in fact, there is! It's called Symfony. And so we started adopting components out of the Symfony framework. Drupal 8 now includes components from Symfony, about 9 of them. Symfony 2 is actually like 30 components. We're only using 9 of them. That's fine. That's still a huge benefit to us and a huge change to Drupal's architecture. But we're also using code from Symfony CMF, which is arguably a competitor to Drupal. We're using the Zen feed library because we wanted to replace our aging and crappy 2001 era RSS parser. We looked around and said, all right, what are people actually using? And everyone in the Symfony world said, we're using Zend. I said, cool, okay. We're using the Doctrine Annotations library. Not the entirety of Doctrine, just the Annotations library. We're using Guzzle for our HTTP client, which is good, because the old HTTP client we had a cyclomatic complexity of like 41. So those charts that Brandon was showing before, it would be below 0 on a grade there. So we deleted it and replaced it with Guzzle. EasyRDF for our RDF parsing, where you have ascetic for CSS and JavaScript handling. We're using Twig for our templating language now, rather than our homegrown PHP-based one. We've actually started using PHP unit for a change, instead of writing our own unit testing framework too, which is kind of nice. And we've been giving back. This is the collaboration that is made possible by these changes. So Symfony's flash message system was very primitive. We needed something fancier. So we designed something better, and someone from the Zakula CMS actually wrote it for us as a patch to Symfony. Binary file response. You wanted to serve, Symfony had the ability to serve streamed responses, but if you wanted to serve an actual file off disk, you had to write a lot of code yourself. So we need to do that. Let's just write it upstream. So Drupal developers wrote that and added it to Symfony. Some extra stuff along the way for other components. We did some improvements to the routing system. The Symfony CMF router. Symfony CMF is a competitor to Drupal. It's a content management framework built as a bunch of bundles you add to Symfony. But they had advanced routing needs. We had advanced routing needs. So we got together and wrote a extension to the Symfony routing system together that we're using, Symfony CMF is using, and EasyPublish is now using. So I'm now an EasyPublish developer via Symfony CMF, which is pretty damn awesome. That's what collaboration can do. Lots of other odds and ends here and there, both directions. We've been working with others as well. Doctrine Annotations wasn't fast enough or scalable enough for what we needed to do. So we helped rewrite their parser to make it faster. The Guzzle library. Who used Guzzle back in Guzzle 2? All right. Guzzle 2 was one big monolithic system. It was over a megabyte in size. What's that? And apparently it sucked. He said it, not me. And we didn't want to pull in a megabyte worth of code just to be able to send GET requests. So the maintainer of Guzzle refactored the code into lots of smaller components so that we could pull in just the pieces we wanted. And this is good for everybody. Zenfeed did the same thing. Zen's system is not as loosely coupled as Symfony's, so there were like 9 dependencies on half of Zend in order to use the Zenfeed library, and we were not cool with that. So I emailed the 2 leads for Zen Framework and said, hey, can we do something about this? And they said, give me a weekend. And we came back after the weekend, and there were now only 2 dependencies. And we're like, cool, we're good with that. And we started using the ZenFeed library, which means everyone using ZenFeed benefits from more loose coupling. Symfony and Zend are working together too. The proxy manager component is used by both Zend and Symfony to do lazy loading of services in the dependency injection container. It's the same code. When this came out, there were a few people going, "Oh my God, Symfony is using Zend, oh my God." To which the answer is, yes, and it's awesome. And even outside of the PHP world, we've been working with other projects like CK Editor. It's a web front-end editor. It's been working very closely with Drupal and improving their editor so that we could include a WYSIWYG editor in Drupal for the first time ever and get a good one out of it. This is a good thing. Collaboration works. Collaboration makes things better. Because when we work together, when we can join together and build things together and share what we're doing, share our knowledge, that's when progress happens. That's how you get more productive. That is the tenfold improvement in productivity. The new normal these days in the modern PHP world is if you find two different ways to solve a problem, pick the one that results in less code. Not less code in your project, not less code in your repository, not less code that you have to write. Pick the approach that results in less code in the world. Maybe that is writing your own generic solution. Maybe it's using someone else's. Maybe it's helping to extend someone else's. Take the approach that's going to result in less code in the world when you're done to solve the problem, because that means it's generic and reusable and shareable. We have collectively, as the PHP community, replaced not invented here with proudly invented elsewhere. Because really, everybody loves pie. We are no longer a series of islands of the Drupal community and the WordPress community and the Cake community and the Zen community. All of these little islands unto themselves are merging, building bridges between the islands, forming together into one larger collaborative community, one larger collaborative environment. Your colleagues are not just the people at your company or people on the same open source project as you. It's everyone writing PHP. Your colleagues are everyone who has a project on Packagist, all 33,000 of them. That is PHP today, and it is a very wonderful thing. There's an old African proverb, you may have heard this one before. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The PHP world is changing rapidly. The internet is changing rapidly, and we need to go far. Let's go somewhere together. Thank you. Once again, my name is Larry Garfield. I'm with Palantir.net. You can follow me on Twitter, follow the company on Twitter at Palantir. Do sign up for our newsletter. It's very low volume, I swear. It's nice and short. I've got buttons over here. I will be putting these slides online. They'll be tweeted from the @Palantir account later this week. Any questions? I can barely see. Crickets. Yeah.
What's the big process? How do PSRs get born and how do they actually become big?
What is the FIG process? Okay, so very short version. Step one, come up with an idea for something that you think should be a common standard. Talk about it. You can talk about it on the list, you can talk about it elsewhere, that's fine. Eventually put together a working group. A working group consists of an editor, who can be anybody, a sponsor, who must be a voting member of FIG, and a coordinator, who must be a voting member of FIG. And those have to be 3 different people. And then the coordinator calls a vote of the voting members of FIG. And if the vote passes, great. We have a spec that is a proposal. It's not actually a final spec. It's a vote for, yes, we should have a spec for X. So like the vote for PSR 7 was, the draft vote was, or the entrance vote is called, is, yes, we think it's a good idea for Fig to have a standard request-response set of interfaces. Not that this particular proposal is what we want, but the idea of having one. And that's when it gets assigned a number, and it's just an auto-incrementing number. And then the editor is in charge of editing, coming up with ideas, drafting the spec, getting feedback from other people, getting reviews, and so on and so forth, fairly loosey-goosey. And then when the editor feels it's done enough, it gets turned over to the coordinator for a review phase. Must be at least 2 weeks. And that's for final edits, grammar, any last-minute clarifications, not for major changes. And then there's a final vote of the Fig members. And for most things, it's a 50% plus 1 vote. And if it gets accepted, it's in. It's rare for a spec to be called for a vote unless you're pretty sure you're going to get 90% or better. PSR 3 passed unanimously. I expect PSR 6 and PSR 7 will pass close to unanimously once they go to a final vote, which my hope is both of those will be approved by the end of the summer at this point. I'm not going to promise that, but I think that's an acceptable bet to make. PSR 0 versus PSR 4. So, short version. PSR 0, namespace separator and an underscore in the class name turn into directory separators, and that's it from some configured root. PSR 4, underscores mean nothing anymore, and you can configure it so that you can, on the disk, leave out some the first couple of levels of the namespace. Reason being, if you combine, say, Symfony components and Composer, you end up with 5 levels of directory before you get to your actual class. PSR 4 lets you chop off 3 of them because of how you configure things. In actual practice, that means you put a slightly different line into your Composer JSON file, and you can then leave out some directories. So I've got a very small library I wrote that is like 3 classes in it. I just dump them in the top level directory and configure my Composer JSON to say it's the Krell API problem namespace. Just go straight to this directory, skip the first couple. So really all it is shorter paths. That's really all PSR 4 is. And then dropping the underscore magic handling, which was only there for backward compatibility anyway. I'm sorry? If you want to use a class map with Composer, that works fine. It's a generated class map. It'll just scan through the things you say are PSR 0 or PSR 4 and build it. And the class map itself doesn't actually care which it is. So in some ways, the class map from Composer renders PSR 0 and PSR 4 redundant, but they're still very useful for development. So in production, you want to use the class map. So there's a couple of answers to that. So for those who couldn't hear it, it's as PSR specs come out and we have more standard interfaces, is there any reason for there to be more than one implementation? And there are a couple of answers to that. One, the PSR standard interfaces are baselines. So like Drupal just rewrote its logger so that it's using PSR 3 compatible loggers. However, we still have a mechanism for figuring out which logger you're going to use at any given time. That is very different than the one Monolog uses. That's fine, because it's going to log to 3 or 4 different places. You can log to your database, you can log to syslog, you can log to whatever. Different libraries are going to do that differently. That's fine, because the target audience of PSR 3 is not Monolog and Drupal. It's Guzzle and Solarium and Zenfeed and other libraries like that. If you're writing just one standalone library, I want to log stuff. I don't have complex logging needs. I just want to log stuff. So I will use that interface and just call the log method on it or the warning method on it. And what happens on the other side, I don't care. different libraries may handle writing to syslog versus the database versus both differently, and that's where they can be innovative. We have actually turned down proposals for interface standards before on the grounds that this problem space is too, for lack of a better term, interesting to be standardized. Logging is boring. You know, caching is boring. Having getters and setters to build up a request response objects, those are boring. There's really no innovation to be had there. The innovation is on the other side of that interface. But by having that common front end, that means the fancy pants, guzzle request object can be used for the basic stuff by Zend, or by PHP units, or by Gout, or whatever. And sure, the fancy stuff, it can be different. If I need the fancy stuff, I'm going to end up dependent on one library. That's fine, but that baseline is there. So that we're going for things where lowest common denominator is still the 80% case. Are good candidates or fake, which is not everything. Other questions?
Open source communities are kind of clubs or cultures. Yours known kind of in the Drupal community is like the PHP ambassador, or the Drupal ambassador to PHP, or whatever. I'm just wondering, are we doing a good job at that kind of being deliberate and thoughtful about that kind of collaboration, or do we need to be doing?
In my experience, over the past 2 years, the response from the community at large to Drupal's moves in Drupal 8 is very, very positive. It's not perfect, but the usual response I get when talking about Drupal 8 to an audience that is not familiar with it is, I'd written Drupal off before because it was so weird. I should look at it again, which is exactly what we're trying to get. That's exactly the kind of feedback and the kind of response we're looking for. We are doing some things wrong, like we are checking composer libraries into our repository because our build system on Drupal.org is stupid, and we haven't gotten around to fixing that yet. And we know that, and people tell us it's stupid, and they're right. One of these days we'll fix that. I hope it's soon. There's licensing questions. Most of the modern PHP component libraries are using the MIT license. Drupal is GPL. That's never going to change. So there's some question there about what can go which direction. But for the most part, I'd say we're doing a B. It's not perfect, but we're doing fairly well. There's a lot of stuff I wish we would push upstream to Symfony faster, but I expect we'll be using Symfony 3 too, and so when 3 comes out, or starts development, we can be working on that too with more freedom. So we're doing okay, I think. And seeing different projects work on each other's code is just kind of cool. And see it actually, work and be productive is kind of cool. We've got a ways to go, but we're getting a lot better at it. And I can say that it's both Drupal and PHP. Which statistics? For the different projects? I pulled those about a year ago, and I'm pretty sure Drupal and Joomla are at about the same level. WordPress may have actually gone up a little bit, I'm not sure. The PHP is still hovering somewhere around 80%-ish of the web, and there's no signs that's going to change dramatically anytime soon. Yeah. PHP is not going anywhere. I've got another hand over here. Yeah.
Do you see the Drupal modules moving to Composer?
Not in Drupal 8. I hope so in Drupal 9. So we're still a few years away from that. Largely, that's for architectural reasons. Drupal modules. Composer requires you to have command line access in order to download and install things. And then there's really no enable process as part of Composer. Drupal lets you download over the web and install, and we've got a mechanism so it's actually secure, unlike WordPress's approach, which is a gaping security hole. Ours is actually harder to use, but secure. And you can enable and disable modules through the UI. as long as we support people who don't have shell access, it's really hard to go all Composer. I would love it if we could, but there are challenges to it. I do want to get there, though. We're just not there yet. That said, I am encouraging Drupal 8 developers, build as much of your project as you can as a separate Composer library, and then have a bridge module that just uses it and wires it into Drupal and adds a couple of forms and so forth. If you can do that, do so. That's my recommendation. Anyone else?
What are the top 5 biggest things?
Top 5 biggest things in oh my. In terms of the language, in terms of the culture, in terms of oh, you have to give me the hard ones, don't you, Chris? Number one, so this is not in order. This is in the order I'm thinking of them. Number one, more people from project-specific communities showing up at PHP generic events. Lone Star PHP last year had 2 Drupalers at it, myself included. This year was 10. Okay, it's still only 10, but 10 people out of a 200-person conference is a pretty substantial shift from the year before. I'm seeing more of that kind of thing, and I'm trying to encourage as much as I can. So those of you that are used to one PHP community or one project, get to somewhere else and try it out. The number of projects that are switching to PHP 5.4, even though 5.4 still has very small market share with hosts, we don't even need to coordinate a Go PHP 5 this time. I actually proposed it to Fig at one point, but it's sort of happening on its own. Guzzle is going 5.4 because Drupal went 5.4. Aura is trying to. They keep nudging that direction. Symfony and Zend haven't, but Symfony has a lot of traits that they are shipping now, so you can use them. A lot of the Symfony bundles use them as well. So there's a much more organic process for saying, you know what, PHP 5.3 is dead, 5.4 is the legacy version, 5.6 is about to come out, we're pushing forward. I know several of the big Drupal hosts are starting to switch straight to PHP 5.5. Pantheon will be for Drupal 8, and Acquia is now offering it. So that's 3, I think. Or is that 2? 2. 3 more. Yeah, I mentioned that communities cross-pollinating more. Yeah, community in general is getting better. So for those who couldn't hear him, yeah, that's actually a very good one. Nomad PHP, and I'll add to that Crafting Code Tour. So the idea of spending more effort to get more people involved in the broader community as a deliberate effort. That's something that's fairly new and very cool and necessary. Yes. So is that 4 then? 5th big thing this year. I was just pondering that. Yeah, there's talk of PHP 6 actually being a thing, although it may be called PHP 7. That's an open question. Yeah, there's some kind of vote coming up by the internals team on whether it's going to be called PHP 6 or PHP 7. But in any case, there's talk of the next major version of PHP and what that's going to involve, which is still a couple of years away, but that's big, and it's something to keep an eye on. Yeah, there's a lot of RFCs actually about what should go into it. It's a lot of nasty, tight, integrated, complicated discussions on internals. So there's your 5. I think time or? Okay. All right. So do you want to hand them over to Brandon again, or shall I keep going? I'll be hanging around afterward too. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Larry, for coming out and sharing that with us. Give me a second here to change modes and find the right slide. I don't feel right coming and doing just a sales pitch to a group of people. So I've put together a lightning talk about code quality that I want to share with you. It'll take about 10 minutes or so. I'll answer questions. If you have more questions for Larry, feel free to ask those as well. And then we'll all go drinking, at least according to Jonathan. So this is called Your Code Sucks. I've taken bits and pieces of this from a few other talks, as well as some things that I do myself that I'm going to share with you this evening. A little bit about who I am. I used to work at Mozilla. I left Mozilla in January. In large part so that I could do this. Also, I've kind of branched out on my own and doing my own thing with training and books and things like that, as well as some consulting. I know nothing of what you speak. To do what? Oh, no, that was well after I quit. That had nothing to do with it. Thankfully, I was not there during that horrible thing. Anyway, I am an instrument-rated private pilot. This is how I got here. Actually, this picture was taken at Gaithersburg Airport in Maryland just before I left on the whole tour. Thankfully, the plane still looks like that. So I did not. He flew in commercial, but we are flying to Minneapolis tomorrow. And you're right, I am in Minneapolis. We're just going to circle. We're gonna circle. No, we're going to Wisconsin tomorrow, and then hopefully over the Great Lake, over or around, and hopefully we will be heard from again. So let's talk a little bit more about complexity, and I'm not going to go to a big spiel about where complexity comes from. Instead, I'm going to talk about complexity as a measure and what we can do about it in our code. Complexity, there are two ways to measure complexity, at least two ways to measure it programmatically. The first one is known as cyclomatic complexity. Larry mentioned this. There was a function in Drupal that had a cyclomatic complexity of 41, 42, 41? Okay, we'll go with 41. Not that that's very good, yeah. And cyclomatic complexity measures the number of decision points in our code. And a decision point is anything that might be an if, an else, a loop, a switch, something like that, where the code can take one of two or more different paths. So taking a look at a very, very contrived code example, if somebody wrote this for me in an interview, they would not be hired. Let's take a look at the cyclomatic complexity of this. So when we enter the function, of course, that's one. That's the first decision we made, was to go into the function at all. And then each conditional we get to is another until we come up with a cyclomatic complexity of 4. Okay, now we have a number. We have a number of how complex this function happens to be. It doesn't really do any good for us without a scale, right? Well, I borrow this scale from Anthony Ferrara, who does a very much longer version of this talk where he basically eviscerates Drupal. He also eviscerates WordPress, which is awesome. But yes, Drupal 7. Drupal 7. We find out that, in fact, this function is not considered to be complex. Okay. Plus 11, very high complexity. Plus 41, it's off the charts. Okay. But this is really an incomplete measure of complexity because it only measures the decision points in our code. There's another measure that I like a little bit better called npath complexity, which happens to measure the number of unique paths in our code, and also, by the way, happens to be a measure of how many tests it would take to test each unique path through the code. So we take a look at the same code here. We had 4 as a cyclomatic complexity, but we have many more paths because we can go into the function and go all the way to the bottom, or we can go into the first if, or the second if, or the third if, or the first and the third, or the second and the first variety, so on and so forth. And we end up with an npath complexity of 8, almost double the cyclomatic complexity. Now, this is not a 2-to-1 relationship. In fact, most of the time, this is an exponential relationship where it's curved up and to the right. Looks like a startup founder's dream, unless it's his code, okay? Now, the difference here is that because cyclomatic complexity, again, measures the decision points, but n-path complexity measures the paths. And it also tells us that if we were to test every path, it would take 8 tests to test every path. Now, you're not probably going to write 8 tests to test this, but if you were going to write tests, that's how many it would take. So again, we have a number, but we don't have a scale, so let's give it a scale. I still need to fix that bug on this slide. So up to 16, again, is considered low complexity. So again, we're right in the middle of what's considered to be low. And as we go up, of course, our complexity increases. Now, because this is exponential, it's possible for us to have a complexity that is ridiculously high. In fact, there is a method in Drupal 7, the same method, okay. It has a cyclomatic complexity of 41, but an in-path complexity that has more zeros than this room has width. And we take 4 terabytes of single-line tests to test.
That's the function we replace with Guzzle.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, I'm sure someone started to test this and went, screw it, and just put Guzzle in there, right? That's kind of how that went? Okay, all right. Bless you, sir. All right. There you go. I think Anthony Ferrara does much more on this. I think he compares it to, like, he gives you a number of flash drives it would take, a number of hard drives it would take, how many books in the Library of Congress comparatively. It's a good talk. You should go watch it. It's online. Mine doesn't do this justice. Okay, so how do you know what your complexity is? Well, there's some tools you can use in PHP that will tell you, it will give you numbers. You can use PHP LOC, stands for Lines of Code, written by Sebastian Bergman, really smart guy from Germany. In fact, most of the QA tools that we use in PHP are from Germans. In fact, I think they all are from Germans, are they? There's one. Is it? Is it any good? I think he's Austrian, actually. Okay, so most of them are German. This is by Sebastian Bergman. And this will tell you the cyclomatic complexity per line of code in your project. If you want to get a little more specific than that, there's another one called pdepend, which I believe stems from a JavaScript or Java tool that does something similar, and will actually give you method and function level cyclomatic and n-path complexity information. If you just want to know where your violations have occurred, there's PHP-MD, mess detector, and there's a library for that where it will analyze your cyclomatic complexity, and then for a given threshold will tell you, hey, this is high, you should fix it. Now, there are some other things we can do. We can take a look at our code and decide whether or not our code's any good. We can actually use our tests as a measure of code quality. Now, the first thing I like to do when I walk up to a project I've never seen before is I like to look at it and I go, does this even have any tests? I spent last week traveling with Paul Jones, who gives a talk on refactoring your code so that it's, not spaghetti. And one of the things that he mentions is that when you walk into a spaghetti project, there are no tests. If I see no tests, that's a huge red flag that we've got a quality issue. Because I'm pretty sure that in this day and age, you've heard that you should write tests. So if you're not writing them, there's probably a reason why. But let's say that I walk in, I find some tests. So the next question I have, and the next thing that's going to inform me as to the quality of the code, is whether or not the code is covered by tests in any significant way. So I'll take a look at the code coverage reports. Now, the cool thing about code coverage is that you can actually hook this up to Jenkins to do this automatically. And if you're not using a build server and you're not having a one-button push system to deploy your code, that's something you really want to consider investing in, because when it comes to building, you should be building on every commit, running the tests. You can't trust your developers to do it. They won't. I know. How many times have we all pushed up to something and discovered we actually broke the tests? We've all done it. We've all been there. And then when it comes to actually deploying your application, 2 steps gives you twice as many ways to screw it up. So a one-button push system, it's the Joel test, I think, number 7. The question on the Joel test, don't quote me on the number, one button push. Now, note that 100% code coverage is not the end-all, be-all goal. For example, I don't test setters that all they do is take a value and set it. I don't test that. It's going to be covered in some other way. So when it comes to code coverage, 95, 96% is usually good enough for me. If you're shooting for 100%, you sometimes miss the point. What you want is you want to have most of your code covered, if not 95 to 99% of it covered, so that when you come up with a bug, you can write a test for it and nail that bug and never have it come back again, which is really the point. But remember, your tests are only as good as the bugs you've already discovered. So this isn't the goal. Preventing bugs is really the end-all goal that we're trying to go for here. Okay, the third thing you can do to help your code quality is take a look for what are known as code smells. A code smell is something that indicates a deeper problem with your code. If you see it and you realize there's probably a deeper problem here. The developer who developed it may not have known this was a problem, may not have known this was something he shouldn't do, or she shouldn't do. And so what we end up with is a code smell. You can detect these. Again, PHPMD has a library for a bunch of common code smells, globals, die, things like that. But there are some that you don't even need a tool for. You can just see right away in your code. For example, here are some common code smells that you'll find in your code. Here's a piece of sample code. Very basic, does user authentication, user logs in. This is what you might see from a developer who thinks he's doing OO, but is really doing procedural code wrapped in classes. Okay? And I'm even using, when did password verify get in there? Is that 5.5 or 5.4? Okay, it's 5.5? Okay. You guys can argue about this later. It's in 5.4 or 5.5, we'll go with that. You can check the documentation, and one of you is wrong. Okay. So not only is this developer never really learned, but now he's using, at least he's using this, right? That's the point. But there's some things we can fix here that we can look at and we can say, this is a problem. This is something that I need to make high priority to fix. The first one is we're using globals. Anytime I see super globals inside of a class, I want to slap somebody because we want to avoid doing this. This is usually considered bad form. First of all, someone may unset this somewhere and totally hose you. Okay. Second of all, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to effectively test this because these are going to persist across requests, not across requests, but across the same request. Okay. So the scope is global, hence the name global. We want to avoid these. Aura PHP, I really like Aura PHP. It's got a context object in Aura Web. It'll give you a request. It'll set it up with all the super global stuff, but it'll allow you to inject the object and to mock it and test it. I really like that. There are probably others in other libraries and frameworks that I haven't used, but that's the one I use and I really like. We can get rid of these. We're going to skip the sequel because I think everybody knows that's bad. And we're going to move on to the second one, which is the creation of objects inside of other objects. I want to be able to write tests. I want to be able to test my code. I want to know whether or not my code works independent of the database. As long as it gets the information it expects, what will it do? So instantiating objects eliminates my ability to write tests because I can't mock this, I can't stub it, and I can't pull it out. Not to mention, now I have to have a connection to a database. Okay? So anytime I see an object being created instead of injected, that to me is a code smell that we can pull out and fix. In addition, we're using die here if we happen to have an exception. We're at least catching the exception so that it doesn't, bubble up to the top level. But we're doing nothing better than WordPress with its MySQL connect or die with a big H1 that says database connection failed or something like that. We're web programmers. We develop for the web. It is our job to do some kind of presentation when we have a problem. We are not writing Unix tools where exit 1, exit 0 work for us. So let's handle this. Let's do something with this in some way. The last one is a little harder to see. It's that we're doing too much. Not only are we dealing with the globals here and then instantiating objects and stuff, so on and so forth, but now we're actually doing the business logic of our application, stuff that belongs in a model. Okay? So when it comes to doing business logic, that actually belongs in a different part of our application altogether. And when we're doing the password verification here, that's business logic, because we had to change this out. This hasn't been around for very long, so somebody actually went in and changed this. But everywhere we want to do this, we have to change the same function to use the same behavior and so on and so forth. So when it comes to business logic, that belongs in our models. Our controllers are passing information from the view to the model and then back to the view and so on and so forth. That's their job. Business logic belongs elsewhere. Like I said, this is a short lightning talk, but I'll open it up for questions. And if there are no questions, then we'll go somewhere else, I guess. So what questions? Yeah.
What do you recommend for one button deploy the PHP application require?
Well, you can write a script to do that. The way we did it at Socorro, and I realized it was a Python project, is we had a Python script that would do our deploy. So it would pull a copy of the code down. Actually, it was a zip file that it had already built all the dependencies on the build server into a vendor directory. And then it would unpack that, or it would SCP it out to all the servers, unpack it. Based on the configuration for that server, it would set it up. Okay, and that's how we did it. In short, that's the micro version, and it was something I wasn't heavily involved in. So that's all you're really going to get from me. But that's basically how we did it, is the build server produced a tarball that we pushed out to all the boxes when we were ready to deploy. And I would write it as a script. There's Fing. There's a few others that you can use. Fing is probably the most well-known in PHP. But it's really more for build than deploy, but you can deploy with it. That's how I would do it. Get your build server. Your build server is going to need your dependencies anyway. So get it to pull them in. And once it does, tar up the directory and just make a build that way. It's a good question. Any other questions? Jonathan, do you have any, wherever he went, do you have anything for them? Okay, well, thank you all for coming out. Krell and I are going to be here for a little while, so if you have questions for us that you didn't want to ask in front of the group, please feel free. And I hope to see you all at Midwest PHP here sometime in the winter, I guess, the spring. Values of spring in Minnesota. But thank you all for coming out. It was, yeah. I did not know that. Do you have the details?
Yeah, August 7th through 10th is the local group camp. What this is the other PHP folks there.
Cool.
Speaking there too, so back soon.
Yeah.
The 10th is a code sprint, and everyone is welcome.
For Drupal?
Buy a ticket, you're going to have a code sprint here at the nursery. Yep.
Cool. All right, so come out to Drupal camp.
We're throwing out other events. This Thursday and Friday is DevOps MSP on the St. Thomas campus downtown St. Paul.
I wish I could go to that.
DevOps days.
The DevOps Days Chicago call for papers just open as well if you're interested in speaking.
Thank you. Any other events that are happening? Okay. Is Beth organizing that? Okay, Beth is fantastic. She is a great resource in the PHP community. I think she just left PHP Architect to do her own thing. So, yeah, she posted a blog post. So who knows what she's up to next, but whatever it is, it's going to be awesome. So, is she? Okay. So if you're hiring and you want a really, really great editor, technical person, Beth Tucker Long is looking. You should reach out to her. Well, thank you all for coming, and hopefully I'll see you at Midwest PHP.